The rain had finally stopped, but the streets were still wet and shiny under the streetlights. David wiped the fog from his delivery van's windshield and checked his phone. 7 more packages to deliver before he could call it a day. His back ached from lifting boxes all afternoon, and his stomach reminded him that lunch had been just a granola bar eaten between stops. He'd been doing this job for 3 years now. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Well, most of them anyway. David had learned to stretch every dollar, skip the fancy coffee shops, and pack his lunch. Life had taught him to be careful with money, especially after his father passed away and left him responsible for his younger brother's college tuition. As he turned onto Market Street, the downtown area was buzzing with evening shoppers and people heading home from work. Everyone seemed to be in a hurry, wrapped up in their own little worlds. David understood that feeling. Most days he was racing against the clock too, trying to finish his route before the depot closed. That's when he saw him. An old man was leaning against a storefront, one hand pressed against the glass window, the other clutching his chest. His legs seemed to buckle, and before David could even process what was happening, the elderly gentleman slid down to the sidewalk. David hit the brakes without thinking. His van hadn't even come to a complete stop before he was unbuckling his seatbelt. A car behind him honked impatiently, but David barely heard it. He threw on his hazard lights and jumped out. The old man was now sitting on the cold, wet pavement, his expensive-looking coat soaked through. His face was pale, almost gray, and tiny beads of sweat covered his forehead despite the cool evening air. A fancy wooden cane lay a few feet away where it had fallen. David knelt down beside him. Sir, can you hear me?" The old man's eyes were open but unfocused. He was breathing, but in short, shallow gasps that didn't sound right at all. People walked past them. Some glanced over but kept moving. A couple of teenagers crossed the street to avoid them. Everyone had somewhere to be, something more important to do. "Someone call an ambulance," David shouted to the passing crowd. A few people looked, but no one stopped. Everyone just kept walking, eyes down, pretending they didn't see. David pulled out his own phone and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. As he gave the dispatcher their location, he gently touched the old man's shoulder. "Help is coming, okay? Just hang on." The elderly gentleman's lips moved, trying to form words, but nothing came out clearly. David could see a medical alert bracelet on his wrist. He leaned closer to read it. Diabetes, type 1. The pieces clicked together in David's mind. His aunt had diabetes. He'd seen her have a low blood sugar episode once. "Do you have low blood sugar? Can you tell me?" David asked urgently. The old man managed a weak nod. David remembered his aunt always carried glucose tablets or candy. He quickly but carefully searched the man's coat pockets. Nothing. He checked the small leather bag that had fallen beside him. Inside was a wallet, some papers, but no glucose tablets. Think, David, think. He ran back to his van and grabbed the orange juice box from his lunch bag that he'd been saving for later. It wasn't much, but it was something. He rushed back and helped lift the old man's head slightly. "Sir, I need you to try and drink this. Just a little bit. It'll help, I promise." The old man's hands were trembling too much to hold anything, so David held the juice box to his lips. Slow sips. "That's it. You're doing great." Some of the juice dribbled down the man's chin, but he managed to swallow a few mouthfuls. David kept talking to him, keeping him conscious, keeping him present. "The ambulance is coming. You're going to be fine. What's your name?" "Edward," the old man whispered, his voice barely audible. "Edward Harrison." "Okay, Edward." "I'm David. You're going to be just fine. Help is almost here." David could feel his own heart pounding. His deliveries were forgotten. The packages in his van didn't matter. Nothing mattered except making sure this man was okay. He took off his own jacket and draped it over Edward's shoulders, trying to keep him warm. Finally, after what felt like forever but was probably only 10 minutes, David heard the beautiful sound of sirens getting closer. The ambulance pulled up and 2 paramedics jumped out with their equipment. David quickly explained everything to them. The diabetes bracelet, the confusion, the shallow breathing, how much juice he'd managed to get Edward to drink. The paramedics worked fast, checking vital signs, starting an IV, asking Edward questions to assess his mental state. "You did good," one of the paramedics told David. "Real good. That juice probably kept him from losing consciousness completely." As they loaded Edward onto the stretcher, the old man reached out and grabbed David's hand. His grip was weak but determined. His eyes, now a bit clearer, locked onto David's face. "Thank you," Edward whispered. His voice cracked with emotion. "You stopped. You actually stopped?" David squeezed his hand gently. "Of course I stopped. Anyone would have." But even as he said it, David knew it wasn't true. Dozens of people had walked right past Edward. He'd seen it with his own eyes. In a city full of people, sometimes it felt like everyone was invisible to each other. "I won't forget this," Edward said as the paramedics prepared to lift the stretcher into the ambulance. "I won't forget your kindness," David just smiled. "You take care of yourself, okay? And maybe keep some glucose tablets in your pocket from now on." Edward managed a weak smile back. "I will, I promise." The ambulance doors closed and the vehicle pulled away, sirens wailing. David stood there on the sidewalk for a moment, his jacket gone, the evening air making him shiver. His phone buzzed with notifications about his remaining deliveries. He was definitely going to be late finishing his route. But as he climbed back into his van, David didn't feel frustrated or worried about his late deliveries. He felt something else entirely. Relief, gratitude, hope. He'd helped someone today, really helped them. And that felt more valuable than finishing on time or getting a perfect efficiency score. David had no way of knowing that this moment, this simple act of stopping to help a stranger, would change his entire life. He couldn't have imagined what was coming. As he started his van and pulled back into traffic, David was just thinking about one thing. He hoped Edward would be okay. Sometimes life gives us chances to be kind. Sometimes those chances come when we're tired, busy, and running late. And sometimes, without us even knowing it, those small moments of kindness can become turning points in a story bigger than we ever imagined. 3 weeks had passed since that rainy evening, and David had almost forgotten about the whole incident. Almost. Every now and then, when he drove past that same street corner, he'd think about Edward and wonder if the old man was okay. But life had a way of keeping him busy, and those thoughts came and went like clouds passing overhead. It was a Tuesday morning when everything changed. David was getting ready for work, pulling on his work boots and gulping down instant coffee, when he heard the mail slot in his apartment door rattle. A thick cream-colored envelope dropped onto the floor. That was unusual. Most of his mail was bills in thin white envelopes or junk mail he threw away without reading. This looked different. Expensive. The kind of envelope you'd use for a wedding invitation or something formal. He picked it up and felt the weight of it. Heavy paper. His name and address were typed in elegant font. The return address made his eyebrows raise. It was from a law firm downtown. Henderson and Associates. He'd never heard of them. David's stomach dropped. Law firms meant trouble, didn't they? Had he done something wrong? Was someone suing him? His mind raced through possibilities. Maybe he'd accidentally damaged a package and someone was taking legal action. Maybe there was some unpaid parking ticket he'd forgotten about that had turned into a court summons. He tore open the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter on thick letterhead paper and a business card clipped to it. "Dear Mr. David Chen," it began. "We are writing to you regarding a matter of great importance concerning our client, Mr. Edward Harrison. Your presence is requested at our offices this Friday at 2 p.m. to discuss this matter in person. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to confirm your attendance. This is a time-sensitive matter, that was it. No explanation. No details. Just a request to show up at some fancy law office downtown." David read it 3 times, trying to make sense of it. Edward Harrison. That was the old man he'd helped. But why would his lawyer be contacting him? Had Edward passed away? The thought made David's chest tighten. Had something happened after that night? Was he being blamed for something? He looked at the business card. Catherine Wells, senior partner. The office address was in one of those tall glass buildings downtown that David only ever saw from the outside. He was definitely going to be late for work now. David called his supervisor and explained he needed a personal day on Friday. His boss wasn't happy about the short notice, but David had barely taken any days off in the 3 years he'd worked there, so the request was approved. Friday couldn't come fast enough. David barely slept Thursday night, his mind spinning with worst-case scenarios. What if Edward had died and the family was blaming him? What if he'd done something wrong medically? He'd only given the man orange juice, but maybe that had made things worse somehow. When Friday afternoon arrived, David stood outside the towering office building, feeling completely out of place. Everyone walking in and out wore expensive suits and carried leather briefcases. David had worn his best clothes, a button-down shirt and khaki pants he usually saved for family gatherings, but he still felt like a kid playing dress-up. The lobby was all marble and glass with a security desk in the center. David showed his ID and the letter to the guard, who made a phone call and then directed him to the elevators. 20th floor, the guard said, handing back his ID. David's ears popped as the elevator climbed. When the doors opened, he stepped into a reception area that looked like something from a movie. Dark wood paneling, leather chairs, fresh flowers on every surface. A receptionist with perfect hair smiled at him. "David Chen?" she asked. "Yes, that's me. Ms. Wells is expecting you. Please follow me." His sneakers squeaked slightly on the polished floor as he followed her down a hallway lined with closed doors. She stopped at a large wooden door and knocked twice before opening it. "Mr. Chen is here," she announced. The office was huge, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. A woman in her 50s stood from behind a massive desk and walked around to greet him. She was dressed in an elegant navy suit, and her handshake was firm and confident. "David, thank you so much for coming. I'm Catherine Wells. Please have a seat." David sat in one of the leather chairs facing her desk, his hands sweating. Catherine sat down across from him, but not behind her desk. She chose the chair next to his, which somehow made things feel less formal but more nerve-wracking. "I'm sure you're wondering why you're here," she began, her voice kind. "First, let me put your mind at ease. You're not in any trouble. In fact, quite the opposite." David felt his shoulders relax slightly. "Is Edward okay? Mr. Harrison, I mean. Is he all right?" Catherine smiled warmly. "He's doing very well, actually. Thanks in large part to you. But I think it would be better if he explained everything himself." Before David could ask what she meant, a door on the side of the office opened. And there, walking through with a steady gait and a bright smile, was Edward Harrison himself. David stood up so fast he almost knocked over his chair. The old man looked completely different from that night on the street. His color was healthy, his eyes were clear and alert, and he was dressed in an immaculate suit. He looked like a man who belonged in this world of marble lobbies and expensive offices. "David," Edward said, his voice strong and full of emotion. He crossed the room quickly and took both of David's hands in his. "I've been hoping to see you again. Mr. Harrison, I'm so glad you're okay. I was worried. Please call me Edward." "And worried. My boy, you saved my life that night." The old man's eyes were glistening. "You were the only one who stopped." "The only one?" David felt his own throat tightening. "I just did what anyone should do." Edward shook his head. "But that's the point. You did what everyone should do, but what no one else did. Do you know how many people walked past me that night? I counted at least 30 before I started to lose track. 30 people who saw an old man in trouble and decided it wasn't their problem." Catherine brought over a bottle of water for David, who suddenly realized his mouth was very dry. Edward gestured for him to sit back down. "David, I've been trying to find you for weeks. The paramedics didn't have your full information, just your first name. I had to hire a private investigator to track you down through your license plate number from security footage near the scene. You went through all that trouble just to thank me?" Edward smiled, but there was something else in his expression. Something that made David's heart beat faster. "Not just to thank you," Edward said slowly. "I wanted to thank you in person, yes. But I also wanted to meet the man who restored my faith in humanity, and I wanted to talk to you about something important. Something that might sound absolutely crazy at first." David glanced at Catherine, who was watching him with an expression that was hard to read. Anticipation, maybe, or curiosity about how he'd react to whatever was coming next. "Okay," David said quietly. "I'm listening." Edward leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped together. "David, what do you know about me? Did you look me up after that night?" David shook his head. "No, sir. I honestly just hoped you were okay and went on with my life." "That tells me everything I need to know about your character," Edward said. "Let me tell you a story, and then I'm going to make you an offer that will probably sound too good to be true." David sat back in the leather chair, his heart pounding, having absolutely no idea that his entire world was about to turn upside down. Edward settled back in his chair and took a deep breath. David noticed the old man's hands were steady now, so different from that night when they'd been shaking and weak. "I'm 78 years old," Edward began. And I've lived a life that most people would call successful. I started my first company when I was 25. A small tech business back when computers were just becoming common in offices. I worked day and night, barely slept, barely ate, but it paid off. I sold that company 10 years later for more money than I'd ever imagined. David listened quietly, trying to understand where this was going. Then I started another company, and another. Each one more successful than the last. By the time I was 50, I had more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. Edward's voice grew softer. But here's what nobody tells you about success, David. It can be very lonely. Catherine handed Edward a glass of water. He took a sip and continued. I was married once, a long time ago, but I was so focused on building my empire that I forgot to build my marriage. She left, and I can't blame her. We never had children. Well, that was my biggest regret. I have some distant cousins, nephews, and nieces I barely know. And you know when they call me? When they need money. When they want an investment in some ridiculous business idea. When they want me to pay off their debts. There was pain in Edward's voice that made David's chest ache. He thought about his own little brother, how they'd grown closer after their father died, how they looked out for each other. So there I was, Edward continued, 78 years old, more money than I could ever spend. And nobody who cared about me as a person, just people who cared about my bank account. That day you found me, I was actually on my way to this very office to finalize my will. I was going to leave everything to charity. Good causes, but anonymous causes. Nobody who would miss me. Nobody who would remember Edward Harrison as anything more than a name on a donation plaque. Edward leaned forward, his eyes intense now. And then I collapsed, and dozens of people walked past me like I was invisible. Like I was just trash on the sidewalk. In that moment, David, I felt what my whole life had become. Invisible, meaningless. Just another old man nobody had time for. David felt a lump forming in his throat. But then you stopped. You didn't know who I was. You didn't know if I had a penny to my name or $1 billion. You just saw a human being who needed help, and you gave it without hesitation. You held my hand. You gave me your juice, your jacket. You stayed with me when you probably had 100 other places you needed to be. I couldn't just leave you there, David said quietly. Exactly. Edward's face lit up. You couldn't because that's who you are. So I had Catherine here hire an investigator to find you. And do you know what I learned about you, David? David shifted uncomfortably. The idea of someone investigating him felt strange. I learned that you worked 2 jobs. Delivery driver during the day, stocking shelves at a warehouse 3 nights a week. I learned that your father passed away 4 years ago from cancer, leaving medical bills that nearly destroyed your family. I learned that you have a younger brother named Timothy who's in his 2nd year of college, studying engineering. And I learned that you're paying for that college education yourself, because your mother's disability checks barely cover her own expenses. David's face grew hot. His private struggles were laid bare in this fancy office. I also learned, Edward continued, his voice gentle now, that despite working yourself to exhaustion, despite having every reason to be bitter about life, you volunteer at a homeless shelter every Sunday morning. You serve breakfast to people who have even less than you do. Catherine spoke to the shelter director. She said, you're the most reliable volunteer they have. You've never missed a Sunday in 2 years. Tears were building behind David's eyes. He blinked them back. So here's what I want to tell you, David. That night on the street, you didn't just save my life. You reminded me that goodness still exists in this world. You reminded me that there are still people who care about others more than themselves. And you gave me an idea. Catherine pulled out a folder from her desk and handed it to Edward. He placed it on the coffee table between them but didn't open it yet. I've spent the last 3 weeks thinking about what my legacy should be. Not just my money, but my impact. And I've made some decisions that I want to share with you. David's hands were shaking now. He gripped the arms of the chair. First, I'm setting up a foundation, $50 million to help people in situations like yours. People who are working hard, doing the right things but can't get ahead because life dealt them a tough hand. People who need help with medical bills, education costs, emergency situations. Real people with real struggles. David's eyes widened. $50 million. He couldn't even imagine that much money. Second, Edward said, opening the folder, I want you to run that foundation. I want someone who understands struggle, who has empathy, who has proven character. I want you, David, but I don't know anything about running a foundation. I barely finished college myself. I'm just a delivery driver. You're not just anything, Edward said firmly. You're exactly the kind of person who should be making decisions about helping others. I'll teach you everything you need to know. Catherine will help. We'll hire staff. But the heart of it, the soul of it, that comes from you. David felt dizzy. This couldn't be real. The position would pay you a salary of $120,000 a year. Full benefits. You'd never have to work 2 jobs again. You'd have weekends. You'd have a life. Catherine handed David another document. This is separate from the foundation, she explained. Mr. Harrison would also like to make a personal gift to you. Edward nodded. David, I want to give you $2 million immediately. No strings attached. Use it however you want. Pay off those medical bills that are still hanging over your family. Make sure your brother finishes college without stress. Help your mother. Buy yourself a decent car that doesn't break down every other week. Live a little. The room started spinning. $2 million. David couldn't breathe. And one more thing. Edward said softly. Your brother's education. I want to set up a trust fund that covers all of Timothy's expenses. Tuition, books, housing, everything. Through his bachelor's degree and graduate school if he wants it. He'll never have to worry about student loans. David put his head in his hands. This was too much. Too overwhelming. It felt like a dream. Like he'd wake up any minute in his cramped apartment with bills piled on the counter. Why? He whispered. Why me? I didn't do anything special. Edward reached over and placed his hand on David's shoulder. You did everything special. You saw a suffering human being and you helped. Not for reward. Not for recognition. Just because it was right. That's the rarest thing in the world, David. And it's worth more than all my money combined. Catherine handed David a tissue. He hadn't realized he was crying. I know this is a lot to process, Edward said gently. I'm not asking you to decide right now. Take the documents home. Think about it. Talk to your family. Take a week, 2 weeks. Whatever you need. But David, please know this is real. This is happening. And you deserve every bit of it. David looked up at the old man, then at Catherine, then at the documents on the table. His entire life had just been offered to him on a silver platter. A life without struggle, without stress, without working until his body gave out. But the scariest part wasn't the money. It was believing he deserved it. I need some air, David managed to say. Of course, Edward stood up with him. Take all the time you need. But before you go, I want you to know something. You already changed my life that night on the street. Now I'm just trying to return the favor. Please let me do this, David. Not just for you, but for everyone else you'll be able to help through the foundation. Your kindness shouldn't end with me. It should ripple outward. That's the real gift here. David nodded, unable to speak. He shook both their hands and walked out of the office in a daze. As he stepped into the elevator, his reflection stared back at him from the polished walls. He looked the same. But everything had changed, everything. David sat in his delivery van in the parking garage for almost an hour. The folder Edward had given him lay on the passenger seat unopened. His hands were still shaking. He'd tried to start the engine 3 times but couldn't seem to turn the key. $2 million. The words kept echoing in his head like some kind of joke. He made $32,000 a year at his delivery job. $2 million was more money than he'd earn in his entire lifetime, even if he worked until he was 80. Finally, he drove home. The afternoon traffic blurred past him. He barely remembered the drive. His apartment felt different when he walked in. The peeling paint on the walls, the second-hand furniture, the stack of bills on the kitchen counter that he'd been putting off opening. Everything looked the same, but now he saw it through different eyes. This could all change. His whole life could change. He dropped the folder on the small dining table and collapsed onto his worn couch. His phone rang. It was his supervisor, probably wondering why he hadn't shown up for his evening shift at the warehouse. David stared at the phone until it stopped ringing. He'd call back later and explain. Or maybe he wouldn't. His mind was too scrambled to think about stocking shelves right now. The next morning was Saturday. David woke up on the couch, still in his clothes from yesterday. The folder was still on the table. For a moment he wondered if he'd dreamed the whole thing. But there it was, real and solid and terrifying. He made coffee and finally opened the folder. Page after page of legal documents. Trust agreements. Employment contracts. Bank account information. It was all there, written in formal language that made his head spin. But the numbers were clear enough. $2 million. Salary. Benefits. It was real. David picked up his phone and called Timothy. His brother answered on the third ring, sounding half asleep. "Do you know what time it is?" Timothy groaned. "I need to talk to you. Can you come over?" Something in David's voice must have alarmed his brother because Timothy's tone changed immediately. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" "I'm fine. I really need to talk to you, in person. Give me an hour." Timothy arrived in 45 minutes looking worried. He'd thrown on a hoodie and jeans and probably broke every speed limit getting there. He was 20 years old, tall and lanky, with their father's eyes and their mother's stubborn chin. "What happened?" Timothy asked the moment he walked in. "You're scaring me." David handed him the folder. "Read this." Timothy sat down and started going through the documents. David watched his brother's face change as he read. Confusion first, then disbelief, then shock. "Is this real?" Timothy finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Yeah, it's real. $2 million? "David, what did you do?" "Did you rob a bank?" Despite everything, David laughed. "Remember a few weeks ago when I told you I helped that old man who collapsed? Yeah, that was him. Edward Harrison. He's rich. Like really rich. And he wants to give me all this because I helped him." Timothy read through more pages. "He wants to pay for my college? All of it, including graduate school? If you want to go to graduate school, yeah." Timothy looked up at his brother, tears in his eyes. "David, do you know what this means? You've been killing yourself working 2 jobs to pay my tuition. I see how tired you are all the time. I hear you come home at midnight and leave again at 6 in the morning. I've felt guilty about it for 2 years. Don't feel guilty. You're my brother. Of course I'm going to help you. But you shouldn't have to sacrifice your whole life for me." Timothy's voice cracked. "This is incredible. This changes everything. You have to say yes. It feels wrong somehow. Like I'm taking advantage of an old man's gratitude." Timothy stood up and paced the small living room. "Taking advantage? David, you saved his life. And from what this says, he's doing way more than just thanking you. He's giving you a job. A real job helping people. That's not charity. That's opportunity." David rubbed his face with his hands. "I don't know if I can do it. Run a foundation? Me? I barely know how to balance my own checkbook." He said he'd teach you. And you're smart, David. You're way smarter than you give yourself credit for. You just never had the chance to show it because you've been too busy surviving. They talked for hours. Timothy made a good point after good point. This wasn't just about David. It was about all the people the foundation could help. It was about Timothy finishing school without debt. It was about their mother finally getting to relax after years of struggling. "You need to talk to Mom," Timothy said finally. "She should know about this." Their mother lived in a small assisted living apartment across town. Her multiple sclerosis had gotten worse over the years, making it hard for her to live alone. David visited her every week, but this news couldn't wait. They drove there together. Helen was in her wheelchair by the window when they arrived, doing a crossword puzzle. Her face lit up when she saw both her sons. "This is a nice surprise." "Both my boys on a Saturday morning." David pulled up a chair and took his mother's hand. "Mom, something happened. Something big." He told her the whole story. The night he helped Edward, the letter from the lawyer, the meeting, the offer. Helen listened quietly, her eyes growing wider with each detail. When he finished, she was crying. Not sad tears, but the kind that come from relief and joy and too many emotions at once. "Oh, David," she whispered, "my sweet boy, you've been carrying the weight of this family on your shoulders for so long. Your father would be so proud of you, not because of the money, but because of who you are, the kind of man who stops to help a stranger." "I don't know what to do, Mom." Helen reached up and touched his cheek. "Yes, you do. You're just scared, and that's okay. Big changes are scary, but David, listen to me. You deserve this. You've worked so hard. You've sacrificed so much. This isn't luck or charity. This is life finally giving you a chance to breathe. What if I mess it up? What if I take all this and fail?" "Then you fail," she said simply. "But you won't, because failure would mean not trying at all. And that's not who you are." That night, David couldn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table with a notebook, writing down his thoughts. The pros and cons, the fears and hopes. On one side of the paper, he wrote all the reasons to say no. It felt like too much. He might fail. People might think he didn't deserve it. He didn't have the education or experience. On the other side, he wrote the reasons to say yes. He could help his family. He could help other families like his. He'd never have to work himself to exhaustion again. He could finally live instead of just survive. The yes column was longer. On Sunday morning, David went to the homeless shelter like he did every week. He served breakfast to the regular crowd. There was old Jerry, who'd lost his construction job when he injured his back. There was Patricia with her 2 kids living in her car after an eviction. There was young Miguel, just 19, kicked out by his family for being gay. David knew all their stories. He'd heard them over coffee and eggs every Sunday for 2 years. These were real people with real problems. People who'd had bad luck or made mistakes or just fallen through the cracks of a system that didn't catch everyone. As he cleaned up after breakfast, the shelter director, Mrs. Rodriguez, came over to him. "You okay, David? You seem distracted today. Can I ask you something? If someone offered you a chance to help way more people than you could help on your own, would you take it? Even if it felt scary?" Mrs. Rodriguez smiled. In a heartbeat. "David, the hardest part of this work is knowing we can't help everyone. If someone gave me the power to reach more people, to make a bigger difference, I'd be a fool to say no." "Why do you ask?" David looked around the shelter. At the families eating together. At the volunteers serving food. At the simple act of people helping people. This was what mattered. This was what it was all about. "I think I just figured something out," he said. That afternoon, David called Catherine's number. His heart was pounding when she answered. "Catherine, this is David Chen. I've made my decision." There was a pause on the other end. "We're listening. I want to say yes. To all of it. But I need Edward to know something first." "What's that?" "This isn't about the money for me. It's about the work. It's about helping people who need it. That's what I care about. That's what matters. Can you tell him that?" He could hear the smile in Catherine's voice. "I think you should tell him yourself. Can you come to the office tomorrow morning? Edward will be here. He's been hoping you'd say yes." "I'll be there." David hung up and looked around his small apartment one last time as it was. Tomorrow everything would be different. He felt scared. He felt excited. He felt ready. Most of all, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Monday morning felt surreal. David wore the same button-down shirt he'd worn to the first meeting, but this time his hands weren't shaking. He felt calm, certain, like he was walking towards something he was meant to do. Edward was waiting in Catherine's office with the biggest smile David had ever seen on the old man's face. The moment David walked in, Edward stood up and pulled him into a hug. "I knew you'd say yes," Edward said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just knew it." They spent that first day talking about the foundation. Edward wanted David's input on everything. What kind of people should they help? What situations deserved priority? How should they screen applications to make sure help went to those who truly needed it? David found himself speaking passionately about the families he'd met at the shelter. About single parents working 3 jobs. About people bankrupted by medical bills. About kids with brilliant minds who couldn't afford college. Edward listened to every word, taking notes, nodding, asking questions. "You see the world clearly," Edward told him. "You see people clearly. That's what this foundation needs." The paperwork was signed. The money was transferred. David stared at his bank account on his phone and had to sit down. The numbers didn't look real. They looked like a mistake, like someone had added too many zeros. But it was real. His first call was to the hospital that had been sending collection notices about his father's medical bills. He paid off the entire balance, $38,000 gone in an instant. Bills that had haunted him for 4 years, just erased. Then he called his mother's assisted living facility. He upgraded her to a better unit with more space and better care. He set up an account so she'd never have to worry about payment again. Timothy's tuition for the next semester was due in 2 weeks. David paid it along with all the fees, books, and housing. Then he set up the trust fund Edward had promised. His little brother would never have to stress about money while getting his education. But David didn't buy himself a mansion or a fancy car. He moved to a nicer apartment, something clean and safe with actual heat in the winter. He bought a reliable used car to replace his van that broke down every other month. He bought some new clothes that actually fit. Simple things. Normal things. The real change happened at work. The Harrison Foundation opened its doors 6 months later. They'd spent those months setting everything up, hiring a small staff, creating application processes, and establishing partnerships with hospitals and schools and community organizations. David showed up every morning at 8, still not quite believing this was his job. He had an office with his name on the door. David Chen, executive director. It felt like a costume he was wearing, but Edward kept telling him he'd grow into it, and slowly he did. The first family they helped was a single mother named Rita whose daughter had leukemia. The medical bills were crushing her. She was about to lose her house. The foundation paid off her medical debt and covered 6 months of her mortgage while she focused on her daughter's treatment. David was there when they told Rita the news. He watched her break down crying, just like he had cried in Catherine's office. He held her hand just like Edward had held his. That's when it clicked. This was why it had all happened. So he could be for others what Edward had been for him. The stories kept coming. A veteran who'd lost his leg in combat and couldn't afford a prosthetic. A family whose house burned down and had nowhere to go. A talented student accepted to medical school but with no way to pay for it. One by one, the foundation helped them. Not just with money, but with dignity. With respect. With the message that someone cared. David never forgot where he came from. Every Sunday, he still went to the shelter. But now he brought foundation staff with him to meet people and hear their stories. Several families they helped came directly from those Sunday morning conversations. Edward came to the foundation office 3 times a week. He and David would have lunch together, and Edward would share stories from his long life. The mistakes he'd made, the lessons he'd learned, the regrets he carried. David realized that Edward wasn't just mentoring him about running a foundation. He was teaching him about being human. Money doesn't make you happy, Edward told him one afternoon over sandwiches. But having enough of it to stop worrying about survival gives you the freedom to figure out what does make you happy. That's what I'm giving these families. Not happiness, just the freedom to find it. Timothy graduated with his engineering degree debt-free. David sat in the audience next to their mother and Edward, all 3 of them crying happy tears. After the ceremony, Timothy hugged David so tight it hurt. "None of this would have happened without you," Timothy whispered. "Not just the money, everything. You raised me after Dad died. You believed in me. You're the best brother anyone could ask for." A year after the foundation opened, they held their first annual gala to raise additional funds and awareness. David had to give a speech. He'd been dreading it for weeks. Standing in front of 200 wealthy donors in fancy clothes, he felt like that scared delivery driver again, out of place and overwhelmed. But then he looked at the front row. Edward sat there beaming with pride. Next to him was Rita and her daughter, who was now in remission. Miguel from the shelter, who the foundation had helped get job training and an apartment. Patricia and her kids, who now had stable housing. Timothy and his mother. These were his people. This was his purpose. David stepped up to the microphone and told his story. Not a polished, rehearsed version. Just the truth. About being broke and exhausted. About helping an old man on a rainy street. About being terrified to accept a gift he didn't think he deserved. About learning that the greatest gift wasn't the money. It was the chance to multiply kindness. "A year ago, I was a delivery driver working 2 jobs and barely getting by," David said, his voice steady. "I stopped to help someone because it was the right thing to do. I didn't expect anything in return. But what I got back was so much more than money. I got purpose. I got family. I got the chance to help dozens of families stop just surviving and start living." He looked directly at Edward. "You told me that night on the street that you wouldn't forget my kindness. But what you really gave me was the reminder that one moment of compassion can change everything. Not just for the person you help, but for everyone that ripple touches afterward." The room was silent. Then someone started clapping. Then everyone was standing, applauding. David saw people wiping their eyes. After the gala, Edward pulled David aside. The old man looked tired but happier than David had ever seen him. "I'm 79 now," Edward said quietly. "I don't know how many years I have left. But I want you to know something. Finding you that night, building this foundation with you, watching you help all these people, this has been the best year of my life. You didn't just save my life on that sidewalk, David. You gave my life meaning." David felt tears streaming down his face. "You're not just a mentor to me, Edward. You're family. You're the grandfather I never had." They hugged there in the empty hallway, 2 men from completely different worlds brought together by one moment of simple human kindness. 3 years have passed now. The Harrison Foundation has helped over 300 families. David still drives through the city sometimes, though now in a reliable car that doesn't break down. He still stops whenever he sees someone who needs help. He still volunteers at the shelter every Sunday. Edward is 82 now, a little slower but still sharp as ever. He and David have lunch every Tuesday without fail. They've become inseparable, their bond deeper than blood. David learned something important through all of this. Life isn't about waiting for rewards. It's about doing the right thing because it's right. But sometimes when you least expect it, kindness comes back to you multiplied beyond anything you could imagine. He helped an old man who needed him, and in return he gained a family, a purpose, and the power to change lives. But the real reward was simpler than all of that. The real reward was becoming the person he was always meant to be, someone who stopped to help, someone who cared, someone who made the world a little bit better, one act of kindness at a time. And that, David learned, was worth more than all the money in the world.